This week we're going to have some fun with advanced tools in Lightroom and with our digital cameras. We are focusing on high dynamic range images and panoramic images, which have become quite popular ways of shooting with easy access to softwares like Photoshop and now access to Lightroom. First is high dynamic range, which is putting together multiple exposure shots for the highlights, shadows, and midtones, so a modern Ansel Adams approach, but put together in one shot, so everything in the image is accurately exposed. This makes a surreal-like image where all areas are clear and defined. We will be looking at this Photography Life blog that will give detailed instructions and approaches on how to do this. So here's an example of an HDR photo, which is comprised of multiple exposures and then put together in Lightroom. So here are the two images. He just used two, but I would like you to use more than two, if possible. So this blog goes over what HDR is, so I'd like you to read this, and also the HDR requirements. One thing, Adobe Photoshop we will not be using because now Adobe Lightroom has access to HDR merging. You also just will not need 4 and 5 as well. What I really want you to pay attention to is camera settings, because this is what you will be doing in your project. So shooting in RAW, also shooting in aperture mode, paying attention to your camera metering, and also most importantly, you will be bracketing. If this is something that you forgot how to do, or what I'm actually even talking about, over and under exposing your images intentionally, you may want to go back to the basic camera settings in an earlier module. So the rest of it is going over how to shoot and set it up with Photoshop, which in this case we will not be using. So again, most important part of this blog is the top part where it's talking about camera settings and what HDR actually is. Another thing we'll be covering this week is panoramic photography. Again, we will be looking at this Photography Life blog, which gives a great description and examples of what panoramic photography is, how you can shoot it horizontal or vertically, so different types of panoramics, but most importantly, how to photograph panoramas, because this is what you will be doing in your project. Then we will be merging them together quite easily in Lightroom. So again, you have access and a link to these blogs. Please look at this information in detail before you begin shooting your project. So I just want to quickly go over some key points when shooting for panoramic and HDR. The reason is I just want to remind you of these things that already the blog covers, but just these are the key features that you must pay attention to. So for panoramic shooting, I highly suggest using a tripod. If you don't have a tripod, I suggest maybe seeing if you could borrow one, or you can easily get one, purchase one if you're really interested in photography, even at a place like Best Buy for about 20 bucks. But if you really don't want to buy a tripod, not planning on ever probably shooting again, you can use something else just to keep the image stable. So maybe bringing something that you can set your camera on, or if you're shooting handheld in one spot, keep your elbows close to your body and rotate only the upper part of your body, keeping the camera close to your head at all times. So it's possible to shoot panoramics without a tripod, although it might be harder and you might not be getting as good of results. Another thing is, do not use a wide-angle lens. You don't want distortion. So anything 50mm or above, you're going to get better results. Another thing, which you should already have turned off from the beginning of class, is auto ISO. Please make sure this is turned off because you don't want the ISO shifting from image to image. For panoramics, you will be shooting in manual mode. So you can find your exposure in aperture priority or shutter speed priority, and then move your setting to manual mode and put in the correct f-stop and shutter speed. But another thing to pay attention to is take your reading off of something that is an average area for the whole panoramic scene. So do not do a reading of an area that's too bright or too dark in the scene, because one reason you want to work in manual mode is that you don't want the exposure shifting between images. You may want to use a timer or a remote just so you're not shaking the camera as you're taking the exposure, especially if you're using a longer shutter speed. Always shoot the next shot with 20 to 50% of the previous shot in the frame. The blog goes over this in detail and shows you some examples, but I just want you to keep in mind when you're stitching panoramic images together, it's really important that there's not missing areas of the panoramic, or Lightroom will not be able to put all the images together. Now for high dynamic range shooting. So this is what you're going to be doing. You're going to be bracketing your images for this. So always keep the aperture the same and adjust the shutter speed when bracketing. So I suggest for your HDR images to put it in aperture priority mode. I suggest at least taking 3 images, one with the correct metering that your camera tells you, and then one over and underexposed image. So you can do this with auto bracketing if you desire, or you can manually do this in manual mode. Watch out for the moving objects and keep your images as still as possible. Tripods for HDR shooting is advised, or something that will keep your camera still, because it's important that the image looks exactly the same. The reason why you don't want any moving objects or any shifting is because something will happen when you're putting your images together called ghosting, where when it's trying to take all the exposures, you might see a little bit of kind of a ghost effect from things shifting and moving. So for this, again, tripod is advised, but you do not have to use a tripod if you don't have access or do not want to invest in one. So some things, just coming over what we went over in the basics camera setting module. You can turn auto exposure bracketing on your digital camera. Usually you can find this in the menu panel of your digital SLR cameras, where you can see this red area is highlighting that it's not turned on, actually, because it's just right on the 0, meaning that it's not bracketing. But if you click on this option and then rotate the dial so that it's on 1 or 2, then it's going to be taking 2 different shots. So for example, this is showing in your LCD panel that your auto exposure bracketing is on. You have a point, a little mark at the 0 saying first it's going to take a regular exposure with the light meter reading, the accurate light meter reading, and then it's going to underexpose by 2 stops and then overexpose by 2 stops. So we can see that we have these little marks here indicating that we have auto exposure bracketing turned on. So you want to pay attention to when you have it on, but also if you don't want it on, you need to make sure that these marks are not turned on either. You can also just do this manually. So this is showing you example. Again, the 0, when you're moving your aperture and shutter speed, you will get this little mark underneath the numbers indicating if it's over or underexposed. The 0 is indicating that it is a correct exposure, and then a 1 is indicating that it will be like 1, and +2 is indicating that it is overexposed. In this case, this is saying that it's overexposed by 1 stop. If it's going in the opposite direction and with the minus marks, it means it's getting underexposed. So you can manually do this in manual mode if desired. It is up to you how much the range of the images of the bracketing will be. Again, I suggested taking 3 different shots, 1 at the 0 mark, and then 1 at overexposed and underexposed. So it's up to you how dramatic you want that to be. You may want it to be overexposed by 2 stops or underexposed by 2 stops. Remember that you can take as many images as you want and merge them together. So in fact, if you wanted, you can take 1 at the regular exposure, 1 overexposed by 1 stop, 1 overexposed by 2 stops, one overexposed by, one underexposed by 1 stop, and one underexposed by 2 stops. So you would have 5 images to work with. It is up to you how many images you want to use for your HDR, but I suggest using 3.